This past Thursday morning, the Washington National Cathedral hosted the presidential inaugural prayer service. The preacher for the service was the Reverend Dr. William Barber, national co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, and relentless leader of a moral movement focused in part on confronting racial and economic inequality. Dr. Barber's sermon text Thursday morning was from the prophet Isaiah, who centuries ago called on God's people to break the chains of injustice, to share food with the hungry, to house the homeless, to free the oppressed, to become repairers of the breach. The breach is the gap between the way things are and the way God intended them to be. According to Reverend Barber, the breach is when we say one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, with our lips, while we see the rich and the poor living in two very different Americas. The breach is the rupture that keeps us from wholeness and well-being for all. The breach is the gap between truth and lies. It's the breakdown in our communities, the breakdown of our relationships, the breakdown of our sense of concern for the common good. The breach is the division between us. Ultimately, the measure of the breach is the measure of the gap between us and God. In our nation, we've developed neat little categories for talking about all our breaches without having to actually repair them. Rather than actually face hard truths about our history and about ourselves, we instead speak in simple ways about right versus left, red states and blue states, urban and rural, religious and secular. These narratives, with their hard lines and tidy boxes, these narratives keep us all locked in our places, which doesn't heal anything, it doesn't change anything, doesn't repair anything, but it is comfortable because it's familiar. We've gotten used to the space between us. Except now, that space has widened and deepened into a chasm that has sometimes seemed as if it's going to swallow everything. In the pandemic, we've had to live with a literal and physical space between us, a separation that has amplified inequalities and injustices, while at the same time deepening our sense of isolation and our impulses to look out for number one. The chasm between us has also been filled with dangerous speech, which is speech built on dividing us into groups and focused on promoting fear fueled by misinformation and disinformation. Earlier this month, we saw the consequence of such rhetoric when our capital and the very processes of our democracy were violently attacked with deadly results. We watched as our democracy was literally breached. And through all of this, the pandemic and the politics of the pandemic, through all of this, religion itself in our country has become politicized and even weaponized. The language of Christian faith in particular has been used and abused to excuse, embolden, and baptize astonishingly unchristian words and attitudes and actions. Christian nationalism has snaked its way into positions of power and influence. This has all been a very traumatic way of living. And how long this trauma has been going on depends on where you have been located with respect to the breach. The insurrection, the political chaos, the lies, that has been one big layer of our collective trauma. But then there's also the pandemic, a kind of slow-moving trauma that continues to tear things away from us and break us down. But for many in our nation, the pandemic wasn't at all the beginning of trauma. It was just the latest manifestation of it, the latest exacerbation of it. At this point, though, we have been living in the midst of trauma for so long that it's hard to even know what normal is supposed to be anymore, or even a new normal. We've been living from crisis to crisis to crisis. We've gotten so accustomed to our loneliness and fatigue, our tension and anxiety, that we hardly know how to think of life in any other way. There's a new administration in Washington. There are new and hopeful efforts related to the pandemic and related to other things we care about. But for now, for the rest of us, what now? What do we do at this point with the space between us? When Paul wrote his letter to the Christians in Corinth, he was writing to Christians in crisis. They had been accustomed to living a certain way before they had become followers of Christ. And now they were all trying to be Jesus people, and they were having a hard time adjusting. They were in conflict with each other over all kinds of things. And the conflict was tearing them apart. Paul's letters to them were meant to help them understand the necessity of surrendering their old understandings and of letting go of some of their old ways of doing things. He was trying to help them understand that going forward, they had to see differently, and they had to live life differently. They had to see through a lens of faith in God. They had to quit putting their faith in all their old ways and old understandings, the things that had worked for them. They had to choose instead to live by 3 shared, core, radical values: faith, hope, and love. Living by these values was not an individual enterprise. For Paul, the community, not the individual, the community was always the primary concern. The community, not the individual, was the primary ground for decision making. It was the primary ground for action. So he spoke of the community of believers as a body, deeply connected to each other in a lively, life-giving, interdependent, interconnected way. Because of this deep connectivity, The primary concern for each believer was not supposed to be individual goodness or individual rightness or individual happiness. The primary concern was to be the community, the body. How do my decisions, how do my attitudes, how do my actions influence and impact others? And how do we, the community, decide and act and do and think together? In the little passage we heard just a bit ago, we heard Paul addressing the specific issue of eating meat that had been sacrificed to idols. For the Christian, there was really nothing intrinsically wrong with that. Those idols didn't actually have any power, so eating meat that had been sacrificed to them also didn't have any power. It didn't mean anything one way or the other. It didn't do anything. It wasn't wrong. But for some newer Christians and some weaker Christians, the issue of eating meat was fraught with difficulty. The meat that had been sacrificed to idols, it felt wrong. It was a violation to them in their thinking. So for them to see other Christians doing that, doing a thing that they understood as categorically wrong, for them to see other Christians doing that could lead them, the newer Christians, the weaker Christians, to end up violating their own consciences. And so Paul argues that knowledge is not the highest criterion by which to evaluate rightness or wrongness or goodness. Our interconnectedness is the highest criterion. Our interconnectedness is the rule by which we judge what is good and what is right. So a decision could be technically right, but if it hurts another person, it can still be wrong. A decision could be technically wrong, but if it helps another person, if it involves loving another person, could it perhaps actually be right? What you know about right and wrong doesn't really matter if what you do with your knowledge ends up hurting or tearing down others or breaking apart the community. Knowledge puffs up, Paul writes, but love builds up. Love builds up. Isn't that what we are supposed to be doing with the space between us? Paul's imagery of the human body reminds us that what happens to one part of the body affects the whole body. The space between your teeth and your toes is erased when you drop something heavy on your foot. You will feel it all the way in your teeth and everywhere else. If you fill your belly with a bowl of warm soup, that warmth will radiate through your whole body. Likewise in the body of Christ. The space between us is an illusion. We're connected. We're interconnected. Our faith knits us to each other, connects us like sinew holds muscle to bone. We are Christ's body together, and we are in this mess of a world together. And together we are called and empowered to be his body in the world and for the world. Being his body for the world means refusing to let the space between us and the world be filled with fear, harm, hate, lies. Being his body for the world means we speak up with his voice against dangerous rhetoric, especially if that rhetoric has been dressed up with Christian words and concepts. Being his body for the world means resisting the hard lines and tiny boxes of red and blue, right and left, and choosing instead to grapple with the hard truths of injustice and inequity and history and complicity and privilege. Being his body for the world means being willing to let our old ways and old understandings and old knowledge be put to death so that God can do a new thing in us and through us for the world. Being the body of Christ in the world and for the world means being built up by love. Not love in its sweet or saccharine form, not love as an emotion or as simple affection, not love that refuses to see flaws or difficult truths, but love in the form of Christ, love in the self-giving pattern of his life, love as the power of God at work in the world for the good of the world for all. A power made more tangible and more visible in our interconnectedness. There is so much we don't yet know about what lies ahead, and there is so much we cannot change. And there are things we may not ever be able to fix, even with all our knowledge. But knowledge only takes us so far anyway. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. And love will get us where we need to go. Love is what we do with the space between us.